welcome back to the Deep Dive. Have you ever felt like the world's big events, the rise and fall of nations, the economic booms and busts, feel a bit chaotic? Like, history might be rhyming, but you can't quite catch the pattern. What if there's a way to look at these huge global shifts and see clear, repeatable cycles?
Yeah, like a system behind it all.
Exactly. What if understanding those patterns from the past isn't just academic, but actually gives you a crucial lens for navigating the present and whatever comes next?
It's sort of like how a good doctor works, isn't it?
How so?
Well, they don't just treat symptoms in isolation. They study many, many cases of a disease to understand its underlying process, the typical progression.
Oh, okay. So they can predict and treat it better because they've seen the pattern.
Precisely. History, when you look at it systematically across lots of examples, it really does reveal these timeless, universal cause-effect relationships.
So moving beyond just individual stories.
Right, to find the fundamental mechanics at play, the things that keep happening.
And that's exactly what we're exploring today. We're taking a deep dive into the patterns of the changing world order. Our core source material for this comes from Ray Dalio's work on the changing world order. He essentially takes a historical scalpel to centuries of global dynamics.
Yeah, this is a really ambitious project.
Using it to identify these archetypical cycles in how nations and empires rise and, well, eventually decline.
And the approach is very empirical. It looks at a vast amount of data across different civilizations.
Right.
The material highlights a focus on the last 500 years, specifically looking at the Dutch, the British, American, and Chinese empires, among others.
And even further back.
Yeah, it even goes back to significant Chinese dynasties around 600 AD to find those recurring forces that shape these long cycles.
Okay, so what are the big forces this study really zooms in on? What drives these cycles?
Well, it looks at the interplay of money, credit, and debt with economic activity. That's really core.
The financial engine.
Exactly. And then how these financial dynamics link up with the really big political forces, both the conflicts within countries, wealth gaps, political polarization, and the conflicts between countries, rising powers, challenging established ones. It's about understanding the whole interconnected system.
Right. So our mission today is to unpack these patterns and the historical examples laid out in this comprehensive study. We want to understand the key forces that seem to be these timeless drivers and, maybe most importantly, what actionable lessons history genuinely offers for you right now, living through these times.
Yeah, our goal is really to help you cut through the immense complexity of global events.
Because it is complex.
It really is. So we'll distill the core insights from this detailed research so you can feel hopefully well-informed about the massive historical shifts that are shaping our world today.
Okay, let's unpack this then. We should probably start by looking at the core methodology behind this approach, how this study actually analyzes history.
Yeah, the process.
And then the big picture archetype it identifies for the rise and fall of empires.
Okay, so the material describes the process, as we said, much like that doctor studying diseases. Instead of studying one country's history in isolation,
Which is how history is often taught, right? Country by country.
Exactly. Instead, you study many cases of empires or countries rising and declining across different times, different places. From that extensive study, you build a picture of a typical, almost universal progression, an archetype or a template.
So it's not just a few anecdotes, but really looking across hundreds of years, multiple civilizations.
Precisely. The aim is to find those cause-effect relationships that aren't unique to one time or place, but just keep showing up again and again.
Okay.
And once you have that archetype, that template, you can start to develop these if-then decision-making rules.
Like predictive indicators.
Sort of. For example, if you see certain conditions occurring together, things like excessive debt, widening wealth gaps, rising internal conflict, then history suggests specific outcomes become much more likely.
That framing makes history feel less like just a story and more like a science almost.
Yeah.
Like a diagnostic tool you can use.
It is, in a way. You compare current events to that historical template. If things are tracking the archetype's pattern,
You have a sense of what might come.
you have a clearer sense of what typically comes next, yeah. And if they deviate, well, that signals a need to understand why. Why is this time different, or is it different? And maybe refine your understanding of the forces at play.
So it's an ongoing process.
It's described as systematic, iterative. Research broadly, stress test your findings against more historical cases, talk to experts, refine your understanding, and repeat.
And the study emphasizes this over the last 500 years, specifically mentioning the Dutch, British, American, and Chinese cycles as key examples.
Right. Those are the primary case studies, but drawing from many others too, including those earlier Chinese dynasties going way back.
Fascinating. So what does this archetypical big cycle of a country's rise and decline actually look like, according to this research? What are the broad phases?
Broadly speaking, there are three main phases, though they blend into each other. It's not always sharp lines.
Sure, it's process.
First is the ascent phase. This is where a country builds and gains its competitive advantages.
Okay, like what kind of advantages?
Think about smart investments in areas like infrastructure, roads, ports, communication. Education is huge. Research and development, R&D.
The fundamentals of getting stronger.
Exactly.
Yeah.
These investments lead to higher productivity. They foster new technologies, both economic technologies and, importantly, military technology.
Okay, so getting smarter, building better things, being more efficient. That seems like a fundamental way to rise.
It is. And as they become more productive and innovative, they naturally gain a larger share of world trade.
Makes sense.
And to protect that trade, they develop a strong military, particularly naval power, if they want global reach.
Right, projecting power.
And then economically preeminent countries also become the world's leading financial centers. They attract and efficiently allocate global capital.
We saw this with Amsterdam.
Yeah.
Right. Then London.
Then London, and later New York. It's a recurring pattern.
And strong financial markets for debt, equity, currency exchange.
Yeah.
They follow naturally from that.
Exactly. And
Right.
crucially, being dominant in trade and capital flows leads to their currency being used more and more globally.
The reserve currency status.
Yes. Not just for transactions, but as a store of wealth by other countries, big investors. This is how a currency gradually becomes the world reserve currency.
So the Dutch guilder was the first big one.
The first modern one, yes. Then the British pound, and after World War II, the U.S. dollar became dominant, formalized at Bretton Woods in 1944, just as the U.S. was clearly emerging as the preeminent global power.
So that's phase one. Building these interlocking strengths, education, innovation, trade, military, finance, which feed off each other.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually lead to their currency gaining that special reserve status. And the study notes that reserve currency status tends to lag the other fundamentals, right? It's one of the last things to be gained.
That's a really key insight, yeah. And often one of the last things to be lost, too.
Yeah. Why is that?
Well, the trust and the whole infrastructure built around a reserve currency, the payment systems, the habits of central banks and traders, mean its status can persist even as some of the underlying strengths start to wane a bit. It's based on faith and just the sheer functionality of the system that's built around it.
Okay, so it has inertia. What about the next phase then, after the ascent?
The second phase is the top phase. The country is sustaining its peak strength across many dimensions. It's still the dominant power.
Sounds pretty good.
It is, for a while. But as the cycle progresses, the seeds of its eventual decline are often being sown internally and externally, sometimes as a result of its very success.
How does that manifest? What kinds of seeds?
Well, they might start losing some of those competitive advantages we talked about. Maybe others copy their technologies more effectively now.
Okay.
Or maybe their own population becomes less focused on hard work and productivity, maybe a bit more complacent.
Success breeding softness.
Something like that, yeah. They can also become overextended globally, trying to maintain a really costly military presence everywhere, or manage a sprawling empire or network of alliances. That gets expensive.
Right.
And typically, debt burdens for the government, for companies, for individuals, they begin to grow significantly relative to incomes and assets.
So the country still looks strong on the surface,
Yeah.
maybe. But internally, the cracks are starting to appear, often linked to the costs and maybe the complacency that can come with being at the top.
Precisely. Success breeds its own challenges, whether it's other powers rising to compete or internal decay from excesses and inefficiencies setting in.
Which leads us to the third phase.
The decline phase. And this is where you see a self-reinforcing decline across all those key strengths we discussed earlier. Education standards might slip, competitiveness erodes, trade share falls, military advantages lessen, financial health deteriorates.
Sounds like the mirror image of the ascent, a downward spiral where weakening economics affect the military, which affects trade and so on.
That's exactly the pattern described. And while the study identified, I think, 17 important forces driving these movements.
17. Wow.
Yeah, it's detailed. But it highlights that the most important ones, the ones that really reinforce all the other cycles and are absolutely central to the big cycle, are the money and credit cycles.
That makes intuitive sense.
Yeah.
Money is like the fundamental lubricant of the whole economy in the system. So let's deep dive into that financial core: money, credit, debt, and economic cycles. How does that basic mechanic work, whether you're talking about an individual, a company, or a whole country?
Okay. At its most fundamental level, just think about a simple income statement and a balance sheet. We all have them, even if we don't call them that.
Okay.
For any entity, you, me, a company, a government, even the whole economy, if your income is less than your expenses, you have a shortfall. Simple as that.
Right. You're spending more than you're making.
Exactly. To cover that shortfall, you have two basic options. You can draw down your savings if you have any, those are assets on your balance sheet, or you can borrow money, which creates a liability on your balance sheet. Debt.
And if your assets are less than your liabilities, you're heading for trouble. Big trouble.
Correct. The material really stresses this simple but kind of brutal principle that debt eats equity.
Explain that.
Well, if you have debt against an asset like a mortgage on your home or a loan against your business, and you can't generate enough income to service that debt, pay the interest and principal. The creditor, the lender, has a claim on that asset that comes before your claim as the owner with equity. Their claim gets paid first.
So if things go bad, they get the house or the business, not you.
Essentially, yes. When income falls below expenses for long enough and your liabilities start to overwhelm your assets, you're on a path where assets have to be sold, or you go broke. Default.
It's a tough reality, but clear. And the study asks us, the listener, to think about this for ourselves, then extrapolate it.
Yes, because the economy is just the interconnected sum of all these entities, millions of individuals, companies, nonprofits, state and local governments, the federal government, all doing the same basic things.
My spending is your income.
Exactly. Your spending is someone else's income, and if you borrow, that creates a debt for you, but it's an asset for whoever lent you the money. So if you can see these dynamics in your own life, you can scale it up and see how everyone's finances are linked together in the whole system.
And the material highlights a major problem we collectively face right now, based on this framework, a sort of diagnosis of the present.
Yes, it points out that today, many entities across the economy, households, businesses, and especially governments in many developed countries, have low incomes relative to their expenses.
Okay.
And crucially, their debts and other long-term liabilities, things like obligations for pensions and healthcare, which are like debts owed in the future, are very, very large relative to their assets.
That feels counterintuitive sometimes, though, because some entities look very wealthy. Countries, companies.
Yeah. Exactly, and the source notes this specifically. Many entities might appear rich because they're currently spending a lot, maybe because they have a large amount of cash on hand from past borrowing or asset sales, or they own significant assets like property or stocks.
Right.
But if you project their finances out into the future, you see that their projected incomes aren't sufficient to meet their projected expenses and service them massive liabilities. They are effectively going broke over the long term, even if they look flush in the short term.
That's a really critical distinction. Looking rich while actually being financially unsustainable.
It is.
How does lending fit into this picture? And what happens when debt becomes unproductive or just overwhelming?
Well, productive lending is the ideal scenario, right? It's the engine of healthy growth. A lender provides money. A borrower uses it for something productive, building a factory, starting a profitable business, getting an education that boosts their earning power.
Something that generates more income.
Exactly. The borrower generates more income than they needed to service the debt, so they pay back the lender with interest, they keep a profit, and society benefits from the increased productivity and economic activity. The debt is an asset for the lender, a liability for the borrower, but everyone benefits when it's productive.
But problems arise when the lending isn't productive. Maybe it just fuels consumption or speculation. Or when total debt simply gets too large for the borrowers to service, even if it was initially productive.
Right. That's when the system starts to creak. When holders of debt, the lenders begin to doubt they'll get adequate returns.
Why would they doubt that?
Well, maybe the borrowers aren't generating enough income anymore. Or maybe the value of the money they'll be paid back in is eroding because of inflation.
Oh, okay.
See, debt assets like bonds or loans, they're supposed to be reliable storeholds of wealth that you can easily convert into money or use to buy goods and services. Sure. When many holders of debt try to convert their assets all at once, maybe selling their bonds aggressively, trying to withdraw cash from a bank that holds lots of loans, that's a run.
Like a classic bank run, but potentially on a much larger scale, involving government bonds, the whole financial system.
Precisely. And the central bank, or sometimes a private bank that's just too big to fail, is then in a severe bind, a real dilemma.
What's the dilemma?
If they just let market forces work, interest rates will shoot up as everyone tries to sell debt and demand cash.
Right, supply and demand for money.
But higher interest rates make it even harder for borrowers to service their existing debt, triggering defaults, bankruptcies, and worsening the whole economy, a downward spiral.
So that's option one.
Yeah.
Let it crash. What's the alternative?
The alternative is for the central bank to step in, essentially print money, create new money electronically, and use it to buy up those bonds that everyone is selling.
To prop up the price and keep interest rates down.
Exactly. To prevent rates from rising, stop the run, and hopefully restore confidence.
And the material says they inevitably choose the latter, the printing money option, which leads to devaluation.
Invariably, especially in a systemic crisis affecting the whole economy or the government's own debt, they simply don't have enough real money, meaning gold, or claims on real productive assets, goods, services, to meet all the claims represented by the vast amount of outstanding debt.
So they have to create nominal money.
Their practical choice is between a hard default on the claims, basically telling debt holders, sorry, you just won't get paid back in full, or maybe at all.
Which is politically disastrous.
Or printing money and thus devaluing the currency, making the debt easier to pay back in cheaper, less valuable money. Devaluation is almost always the chosen path for governments and central banks in this situation.
And the more debt there is.
The more debt there is in the system, the more likely a significant devaluation is needed to ease that burden and keep the system from collapsing entirely.
Okay, this is where the whole idea of a reserve currency becomes so critical. Can you explain what that is again, and what's the big privilege and the big risk associated with it?
Sure. A reserve currency is one that's widely accepted globally, not just in its home country. It's used for conducting international transactions, trade, investment, and it's held as a store of wealth by other countries' central banks, large institutions, international investors.
Like the U.S. dollar today.
Exactly. The country that issues this currency, the U.S. with the dollar, currently holds a uniquely privileged and powerful position.
How so?
Well, its debt, denominated in its own currency, like U.S. Treasury bonds, becomes a fundamental asset class for investors and central banks worldwide. Everyone needs and wants dollars and dollar assets. This allows the issuing country to borrow money and purchase goods and services from the rest of the world far more easily and cheaply than any other country. They can effectively run large government deficits and trade deficits and pay for them simply by issuing more debt that the rest of the world is eager or maybe feels compelled to buy because it's in the global reserve currency.
It's an enormous economic and geopolitical advantage, a huge benefit. But you mentioned a big risk.
The critical point, highlighted really emphatically in the study, is that all past reserve currencies throughout history, the Dutch guilder, the British pound, and others before them have eventually ceased to be reserve currencies.
All of them.
Every single one. And this transition, this loss of status, has often been traumatic for the issuing country. It frequently involves financial crises, internal conflict, a loss of global standing, a painful adjustment. Reserve currency status is not a permanent state of affairs.
That's a sobering thought. So, based on this framework of debt cycles and reserve currencies, where does the material place the U.S. right now in its current debt cycle?
It's described as being in a late cycle phase, sometimes called the long-term debt supercycle.
Okay.
There is just a massive amount of debt accumulated throughout the system, government, corporate, household, over many decades. And crucially, to keep the economy functioning and avoid a really painful deleveraging or depression, the system needs to produce even more debt just to stand still or grow slowly.
But who buys all this new debt if returns are low?
Well, that's the issue. Traditional means of financing this debt, like domestic savings or foreign investments seeking good returns, are often insufficient, or they would require interest rates so high they would crash the economy.
Right.
So increasingly, the government's large deficits have to be monetized. That means the central bank effectively creates new money to buy the government's bonds, financing the government's spending indirectly.
This is what's sometimes called monetary policy 3, or MP3.
Yes, exactly. It's seen as a distinct step beyond just lowering interest rates, which is MP1, or buying existing assets from banks to inject liquidity, known as quantitative easing.
MP2.
MP3 is more about the direct coordination between the central bank and the government to finance spending through money creation.
That definitely sounds like a classic move you'd expect late in this kind of long-term debt cycle.
It is. It's a sign that the debt burden has become extremely large.
And the U.S. reserve currency status, while a privilege, has actually contributed to getting into the situation.
Paradoxically, yes. It allowed the U.S. to run large trade deficits for decades, buying more goods from the world than it sold, and to borrow excessively from the rest of the world to finance this consumption and government spending.
Right.
Countries like China, Japan, oil exporters, they accumulated vast dollar reserves by selling goods to the U.S. And what did they do with those dollars? They saved them largely by buying U.S. dollar assets, particularly U.S. Treasury bonds.
Lending the money back to the U.S.
Exactly. This created the current kind of awkward situation where the dominant world power, the U.S., is also the world's largest debtor nation, owing trillions of dollars to countries like China, which are simultaneously major creditors and geopolitical rivals.
Okay, how does this process of money printing actually devalue the currency, and what is that devaluation measured against? You mentioned it's about easing the debt burden.
Right. When the central bank dramatically increases the supply of money and credit in the system, it reduces the value of each unit of money and credit already outstanding. It's basic supply and demand. More supply means lower value, all else equal.
So who does that hurt and who does it help?
It hurts those who are holding money or assets denominated in that currency, cash savers, bondholders, anyone owed a fixed amount of that money. Their wealth and purchasing power are eroding due to inflation or just the debasement.
But it helps the debtors.
Yes, it relieves the burden for those who owe debt denominated in that currency because they can pay it back with money that is worth less in real terms. It's easier to pay off old debts with new, cheaper money.
So the goal of printing, from the government or central bank's perspective in a debt crisis, is fundamentally to reduce the real burden of debt by making the money cheaper.
Exactly. The material argues the most important thing currencies devalue against is debt itself. That's the primary target, making the debt burden manageable.
But they also devalue against other things.
Yes. They also devalue against real hard assets that cannot be printed into existence. Things like gold, silver, commodities, sometimes productive land or real estate, maybe even other currencies that are perceived as more stable.
Why do people shift into those?
Well, when returns on cash and debt assets become really unattractive, maybe interest rates are near zero or even negative after you account for inflation.
Right, you're losing purchasing power just holding bonds.
Exactly. And if inflation is rising or expected to rise, money naturally flows out of those paper assets and into things that are expected to hold their value or appreciate in real terms. Inflation hedge assets, commodities, maybe cryptocurrencies for some, or even other countries' currencies if they look safer.
And faced with the choice between letting interest rates rise sharply to attract capital back to bonds, which could crash the economy,
or printing money to keep rates low and buy assets themselves, central banks inevitably choose printing and buying.
which reinforces the problem for the currency.
It reinforces the incentive to move out of cash and debt, which puts further downward pressure on the currency's value. It's a difficult cycle to escape once you're deep into it.
And the deeper you are into the long-term debt cycle with these huge levels of debt and money, and the need for ultra-low real interest rates just to keep debtors afloat,
The higher the probability of a breakdown in the currency and the monetary system itself.
does this devaluation happen slowly or quickly?
The study notes that large devaluations don't usually happen gradually, like a slow slide. They are typically abrupt declines, often happening during major debt crises, separated by periods of relative stability. It's more like stair steps down than a smooth ramp. The research identified 6 major devaluations of leading reserve currencies just since 1850.
Okay, let's look at some of those historical examples mentioned in the source to see these financial dynamics play out in real time. The 1930s are cited as a key example, right? The Great Depression era.
Yes, the 1930s saw a severe global debt crisis that really intensified between 1930 and 1933. And it wasn't just a U.S. phenomenon, it was worldwide, leading to massive economic contractions everywhere.
And how did countries respond financially?
Many responded by abandoning the gold standard, which had previously constrained their ability to print money. Once free from that constraint, they engaged in competitive devaluations.
What does that mean?
One country would deliberately weaken its currency to make its exports cheaper and try to steal growth from other countries. But then those other countries would retaliate by devaluing their own currencies.
A race to the bottom for currency values.
Pretty much. This downward spiral eroded the value of money across many countries in the years leading into World War II. And importantly, This period was also marked by rising internal conflicts over wealth, rich versus poor, labor versus capital, and escalating conflicts between nations. The economic stress fueled political extremism and international tension.
Then, jumping ahead, after World War II in 1945, the financial landscape was dramatically reset. How did that happen?
It was a complete reset. For the losing powers, Germany, Japan, Italy, the value of their money and their government debt was effectively wiped out. Hyperinflation, currency reforms. Their savers and bondholders lost almost everything.
And even for the winners.
Even for the nominal winners, like Great Britain and France, their currencies and debts were severely devalued. They had borrowed massively to fight the war. So even though they were on the winning side, their financial positions were wrecked.
So the war itself acted as a massive financial reset mechanism.
It did. The study highlights that during the war years itself, the traditional international monetary system basically broke down. Gold, silver, or even barter were often used for critical international trade, and governments imposed strict price controls and rationing internally. The old financial order was shattered.
And the U.S. emerged in a uniquely strong position.
Uniquely strong. It came out of the war holding roughly 2/3 of the entire world's official gold reserves. Its industrial base was untouched by war damage, actually strengthened by war production.
Which allowed it to lead the creation of a new system.
Exactly. This position of unprecedented strength allowed the U.S. to take the lead in designing a new world order and a new monetary system at the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944.
And that's where the dollar became king.
The U.S. dollar was established as the dominant global currency, linked to gold at a fixed price of $35 per ounce. Other major currencies were then pegged to the dollar at fixed rates. This was what the source calls a Type 2 monetary system paper currency backed by a physical commodity, in this case gold.
And why did that system work initially?
It worked because the U.S. had the gold to back the dollar, at least initially, and it had the dominant economic and military power to essentially underwrite and enforce the system. Mm-hmm. And crucially, unlike the punitive reparations demanded from Germany after WWI, which destabilized Europe, the U.S. provided massive financial aid through the Marshall Plan to help rebuild both its allies and former enemies, like Germany and Japan. This helped stabilize the new economic order and build support for the dollar-based system.
But that system, the Bretton Woods system tied to gold, didn't last forever.
No, it lasted about 27 years. By 1971, it was becoming clear that the U.S. had printed far more dollars, both domestically and held abroad, than it actually had gold in Fort Knox to back them up at $35 an ounce.
Why had they printed so many dollars?
A combination of factors. Rising military spending, especially for the Vietnam War, and expanding domestic social programs, the guns and butter issue. Plus, other countries, having rebuilt their economies, were starting to accumulate large dollar surpluses and were increasingly asking to exchange those dollars for U.S. gold, as they were entitled to do under the agreement.
Putting pressure on U.S. gold reserves.
Exactly. So in August 1971, President Nixon announced that the U.S. would no longer convert dollars into gold for foreign central banks. This was effectively a default on the core promise of the Bretton Woods system. It ended the gold backing of the dollar and shifted the entire world onto a fiat monetary system.
Explain fiat money again briefly.
Fiat means the value of the currency isn't tied to a physical commodity like gold or silver. Its value is based purely on government decree. The government says it's money, and the faith people have in that government and its ability to manage the economy and the currency's purchasing power.
Okay. And what were the immediate financial consequences of moving to that fiat system in 71? The source mentioned a massive acceleration.
Yes. Removing the constraint of gold convertibility essentially unleashed a massive acceleration in the creation of money and credit globally, led by the U.S.
And the result was?
High inflation. The 1970s saw soaring inflation in commodity prices, particularly from 1971 to around 1981. There was a panic to sell bonds because their fixed interest payments were being rapidly eroded by inflation.
So bond prices fell, interest rates shot up.
Dramatically. And at the same time, there was a run into hard assets, anything seen as a store of value during high inflation. Things like real estate, commodities, and especially gold.
That's when gold went parabolic.
Right.
For $35 an ounce.
It peaked around $850 an ounce in early 1980. A huge move, reflecting capital fleeing from paper assets like bonds and dollars into tangible assets perceived as safe havens.
Wow.
The material describes the inflation psychology that developed, especially in the U.S. People felt compelled to borrow money and spend their paychecks as quickly as possible just to stay ahead of rising prices. By now, because it will cost more tomorrow.
That sounds destabilizing.
It became a major economic and political crisis. It led to various attempts to control inflation, including wage and price controls under Nixon, which largely failed. Ford had his whip inflation now, or win buttons.
Right, I remember those.
Before finally, Paul Volcker, as Fed chair under President Carter and then Reagan, had to aggressively raise interest rates to incredibly high levels to break the back of inflation, which triggered a deep and painful recession in the early 1980s.
Okay, so after that period of high inflation was broken in the early 80s, the material talks about subsequent waves of debt finance growth leading up to today. Different cycles, but still fueled by debt.
That's right. After the painful adjustment of the early 1980s recession, the economy began to grow again. But increasingly, this growth was fueled by ever larger expansions of credit and debt, leading to a series of cycles, each culminating in some kind of asset bubble.
Did you give the examples mentioned?
Sure. There was the cycle from roughly 1982 to 2000, which ended with the dot-com stock market bubble bursting. Then the cycle from 2002 to 2007, fueled by cheap money and lax lending standards, leading to the U.S. housing bubble and the subsequent global financial crisis of 2008.
The Great Recession.
Right. And then the period from 2009 to 2019, which saw significant debt-fueled investment and asset price increases, stocks, bonds, real estate, again, in many places, preceding the downturn triggered by the COVID-19 pandemic.
And what was the pattern in each of these cycles in terms of debt and central bank response?
Each cycle added more debt and also more future liabilities, like those unfunded pension and healthcare promises, onto the balance sheets of households, corporations, and especially governments.
Okay.
And each time there was a downturn or a crisis, central banks responded by pushing interest rates lower than they were in the previous cycle. Eventually, rates hit zero or near zero.
And then they needed new tools.
Exactly. They resorted to quantitative easing, QE, or MP2, buying large amounts of government bonds and other assets to push long-term rates down and inject liquidity. This pattern of accumulating more debt and responding to crises with progressively lower rates and more unconventional monetary policy repeated, bringing us to a point where global debt levels are historically unprecedented.
Which brings us right up to the COVID-19 period starting in 2020. How did that fit the pattern?
The pandemic acted as a sudden, sharp trigger, a massive external shock. It caused huge disruptions to incomes for people and businesses, creating big holes in balance sheets across the economy almost overnight.
And the response?
Faced with a potential economic collapse far worse than 2008, governments and central banks again stepped in, but this time employing MP3, that direct coordination of monetary and fiscal policy on a scale never before seen in peacetime.
The study mentions the Fed's huge program in April 2020, including direct payments to individuals, helicopter money.
Yes. The scale and the nature of the response central banks essentially financing massive government spending programs, including sending checks directly to citizens, enabled by the Treasury and Fed working hand in glove, is compared in the source to President Franklin Roosevelt's actions starting March 5, 1933, right at the depths of the Great Depression.
What was the similarity?
Both involved dramatic, unconventional money and credit creation by the government and central bank acting together. And interestingly, the study notes they had similar immediate results in the markets. A significant devaluation of the currency against gold and other assets, a sharp rally in the stock market as the new money flowed into financial assets, and a significant rise in the price of gold, reflecting that flight from potentially debased paper money.
And other countries followed suit.
Yes, many other central banks and governments implemented similar large-scale stimulus programs, but the Fed's actions were the most significant globally because of the dollar's central role as the world's reserve currency. Their actions ripple out everywhere.
It's really remarkable, isn't it, how the fundamental dynamics of money, credit, and debt crises and the government responses seem to echo across these very different historical periods, whether triggered by a depression, war, or a pandemic.
It absolutely highlights that there appear to be deep, recurring patterns in how financial systems evolve, become over-leveraged, face crises, and how authorities tend to react when faced with the possibility of a complete system-wide collapse. The playbook seems quite consistent over time.
Okay, let's shift now to part 3 and apply these cycle ideas to the specific examples of empires discussed in the material focusing on the Dutch, British, American, and Chinese cycles. Let's start with the Dutch story. How does their rise and fall illustrate this big cycle archetype we've been discussing?
The Dutch Republic is a fascinating case study. They rose to prominence after gaining independence from Spain in 1581. Their peak power, their golden age, came around 1650.
And the key question this study asks is, how did that happen? How did this small nation become a global superpower?
Exactly. And the answer lies in them building those fundamental strengths we talked about in the ascent phase. First, the Dutch were superbly educated for their time.
Oh, yeah.
And incredibly inventive. The source estimates they accounted for roughly 25% of major global inventions in the 17th century.
25% of all major global inventions. For one small country, that's astounding.
It really is. And their inventions weren't just theoretical, they were practical and hugely impactful. Two key areas are highlighted. First, ships. They developed ship designs, like the famous Fluit, that were uniquely efficient for bulk cargo trade, giving them a huge cost advantage. They also built powerful warships. This gave them global reach and military muscle.
Okay, ships were key. What else?
Second, and perhaps even more fundamentally, they essentially invented modern capitalism. They created the first public markets for government debt and corporate equity. They founded the first publicly listed company, the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, in 1602, which pooled capital from many investors for high-risk, high-reward global ventures. They established the first formal stock exchange in Amsterdam, and they developed sophisticated banking and lending systems.
So they weren't just players in the emerging global economy. They literally created the system, the financial infrastructure that enabled modern global trade and finance.
Precisely. This financial and trading dominance made Amsterdam the world's undisputed leading financial center. This powerful combination of economic innovation, military strength based on naval power, and financial ingenuity led the Dutch guilder to become the world's first widely accepted reserve currency, used for transactions and savings far beyond Dutch borders, alongside gold and silver.
So they hit all the markers of the ascent phase and reached the top. How did their decline begin to set in following the archetypes?
Well, the seeds of decline started appearing in the latter half of the 17th century, even during their golden age. Other countries, particularly rivals like Britain and France, started copying their technologies, their ship designs, their trade methods. This began to erode the Dutch competitive advantage.
Okay, so competition increased.
Right. Also, maintaining their global trading network and fighting numerous wars to protect it, especially against the English and French, became increasingly costly. They became somewhat overextended, like many empires do.
The cost of being number one.
Exactly. And debt burdens, both for the Dutch government and key entities like the VOC, began to grow significantly throughout the 18th century. As their competitiveness weakened, their income from trade and foreign investment started to fall, making it harder to service that debt.
And the study notes an interesting capital flow dynamic here. Wealthy Dutch savers started moving their money abroad.
Yes, that's a classic sign of decline mentioned. Wealthy Dutch investors, seeing better returns and perhaps a more promising future elsewhere, began shifting their capital abroad, particularly into British investments, as Britain's power was clearly rising.
But the Dutch currency, the guilder, held up for a while.
It did. It's interesting the guilder's status as the reserve currency held up for quite a while, even as these other fundamental economic and competitive strengths were weakening. This illustrates that lag effect we discussed earlier. The reserve status was supported by ingrained habit, trust, and the existing financial infrastructure built around it.
Until it wasn't. When did the decline really accelerate?
The decline accelerated dramatically with the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War, which started in 1780. This war was disastrous for the Dutch.
And what happened financially during that period of accelerated decline? Did we see that run dynamic?
Yes. A classic run unfolded, focused on the Bank of Amsterdam, which was the cornerstone of their financial system. Deposits at the bank, which were supposed to be fully backed by and equivalent to physical gold and silver coins held in the vault, started trading at significant discounts to the actual coins.
People lost faith in the paper claim and wanted the hard money.
Exactly. They wanted the physical specie. The bank tried to defend the guilder and its own credibility by selling its foreign reserves, its holdings of other countries' debt and assets, to buy up guilders and provide coin, but it wasn't enough.
So the reserves ran out.
The accounts supposedly backed by coin at the bank plummeted as people withdrew their physical gold and silver between 1780 and 1783. By 1795, when the French invaded, the bank's deposits were trading at a large discount to their stated value in coin. This just shows how quickly confidence in a currency and its central institution can collapse when the underlying economic and financial fundamentals are weak and there aren't enough hard assets to back all the paper claims.
A very clear example of the cycle. Now, the source mentions the British Empire relatively briefly in comparison, is that right? Especially focusing on its position after WWII.
Yes, the material uses Britain more to illustrate the transition between dominant powers and the dynamics of managing decline, especially in relation to the Dutch before it and the U.S. after it. The focus shifts to Britain after World War II.
What was their situation then?
Britain emerged victorious but financially shattered, heavily indebted, particularly to the U.S., and facing the inevitable end of its vast colonial empire, which had been a source of economic strength. The global financial system was under immense stress, with strict exchange controls remaining on the pound sterling, and a severe global shortage of U.S. dollars needed for trade and rebuilding the so-called dollar gap.
And they tried to restore the pound's role.
Britain attempted to make the pound fully convertible into U.S. dollars in 1947. This was a condition of a large U.S. loan and an attempt to restore London's financial preeminence and make the pound function effectively within the new Bretton Woods system alongside the dollar.
How did that go?
It failed very quickly within weeks. Britain's underlying economy was too weak, its war debts were too large, and domestic crises undermined confidence in the pound. There was a run on sterling as soon as it became convertible.
Leading to a major devaluation eventually.
Yes, a large 30% devaluation of the pound against the dollar was necessary in 1949. The aim was to try and make British exports competitive again and stabilize the situation.
Did that devaluation cause a panic out of sterling debt?
Interestingly, the study notes it didn't trigger a total panic or collapse, partly because a huge amount of UK assets and debt were held by the US government, which basically accepted the loss in value as necessary to support the overall system and its key ally. And also, many countries within the sterling area, former colonies and dominions whose currencies were linked to the pound, were politically tied to Britain and chose to devalue their own currencies alongside the pound, cushioning the blow somewhat.
So external factors and political relationships helped manage the transition. But the devaluation itself clearly signaled the pound's diminished international role compared to the now dominant dollar.
Exactly. It cemented the shift in global financial power from London to New York and from the pound to the dollar.
Okay, now let's turn to the rise of the American empire and the dollar. The source notes its emergence as a leading power even after World War I.
Yes, after WWI at the peace conferences like Versailles in 1919, the U.S. under Woodrow Wilson played a major role and was clearly recognized as a major global power. But then the U.S. largely retreated into isolationism during the 1920s and 30s.
While Britain actually expanded its empire then.
Ironically, yes. And the global monetary system during the interwar period was quite unstable. Several countries, like Germany, experienced sharp currency devaluations and even hyperinflation before finding some stability later in the 1920s, only for it all to collapse again in the 1930s.
So the real focus shifts to the U.S. rise after World War II.
Absolutely. After WWII, the U.S. was undeniably the dominant global power, militarily, economically, financially. Along with Britain and a weakened Soviet Union, the U.S. effectively set the terms for the New World Order at the key wartime and post-war conferences, Bretton Woods for the economy, Yalta and Potsdam for the political map.
And the world got divided.
Pretty much divided into two main blocks: the U.S.-led capitalist democratic bloc and the Soviet-led communist autocratic bloc. The U.S. took the primary leadership role across the board: economics, geopolitics, military alliances like NATO.
And it established that new monetary system we discussed at Bretton Woods, with the dollar linked to gold and other currencies linked to the dollar.
Right. And again, this system worked initially because the U.S. held the vast majority, about 2/3 of the world's official gold reserves, giving credibility to the dollar's gold link. And it had the overwhelming economic and military might to essentially underwrite and enforce the system globally.
Plus the Marshall Plan effect you mentioned.
Yes, that was crucial. Instead of demanding punitive reparations like after WWI, the U.S. provided massive financial aid through the Marshall Plan. This helped rebuild war-torn economies in Europe and Japan, created stable trading partners, fostered goodwill, and helped the new dollar-based system take root successfully. It was a very different, more constructive approach than after WWI.
This ushered in a period of widespread prosperity, didn't it?
Yes. The period from roughly 1950 to 1970 is often seen as a golden age of economic growth and relative stability, particularly in the U.S. and other developed countries operating within this system. It was characterized by productive debt growth. Borrowing was financing productive investment that generated income growth and significant market development. Optimism was generally high.
But true to the archetype, the seeds of future problems were sown even during this good period.
Yes, inevitably. The U.S. government started taking on too much debt. particularly in the 1960s, to finance both large military expenditures, guns, primarily the escalating Vietnam War, and expanding domestic social programs. Butter, like Lyndon Johnson's Great Society and War on Poverty initiatives. Other countries also took on excessive debt within the system,
which eventually strained the system to breaking point.
It strained the Bretton Woods system, particularly the dollar's link to gold. The U.S. simply couldn't credibly maintain that link given its spending, its growing deficits, and the increasing number of dollars held abroad.
Leading to the breakdown in 1971 that we discussed.
Exactly. And that shift to a purely fiat system then unleashed the subsequent waves of accelerating debt creation, financial innovation, deregulation, and asset bubbles. The dot-com bubble, the housing bubble, the post-2008 everything bubble that we talked about earlier in the context of the financial cycle.
And leading us to the point we are at today, facing not only huge financial challenges, but also, as the study emphasizes, widening wealth gaps, value gaps, and deep political polarization within the U.S.
Yes, all classic symptoms identified in the study for a country potentially in the later stages of its big cycle.
Okay, let's turn now to the fourth major case study, China. The material really stresses something interesting here, that understanding Chinese history and philosophy is absolutely fundamental to understanding its leaders' thinking and actions today, more so than perhaps for Western leaders.
This is a key insight presented in the study, yes. It argues that Chinese leaders, perhaps more consciously and consistently than many Western leaders, draw deeply from their exceptionally long history and their ingrained philosophical traditions. Confucianism, Taoism, legalism, overlaid more recently with Marxism, Leninism, and Mao Zedong thought.
And how does that influence their perspective?
One major aspect is that they tend to think in much longer time frames. They often look back centuries and plan ahead for decades, even 100 years or more. Their approach is highly strategic, viewing history in terms of these long, multi-decade phases of national rise and fall, order, and chaos.
Which contrasts with?
Well, the study suggests it contrasts with the sometimes more tactical or short-term focus, often seen in Western political systems, which are frequently driven by shorter election cycles and immediate pressures.
So Chinese actions today are guided by this deep sense of history and a long-term strategy for the nation's place in the world.
That's the argument. The material outlines China's journey since the 1800s in distinct multi-decade phases, which helps understand their current trajectory. It starts with a long period of decline from roughly 1800 until 1949.
The century of humiliation.
Exactly. Often called the century of humiliation, where China's power by almost any measure, education, innovation, economic competitiveness, military strength, share of world trade, financial standing fell to a very low point around 1940-1950. This was due to a combination of internal weakness, civil wars, and exploitation by foreign powers.
Then came the first phase of the modern rise under Mao Zedong.
Right. Phase 1, from 1949 to 1976, the Mao era. This phase was primarily about consolidating power under the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, after decades of internal conflict and war. It was about building the basic foundations of a modern nation-state, establishing new institutions, governance structures, basic infrastructure.
And the system was communist.
Yes, China adopted a communist system with state ownership of the means of production, central planning, a focus on heavy industry, and ruling, at least ideologically, for the workers and peasants against the old capitalist and landlord classes. China was largely isolated from the Western world during this period.
The study notes some early productivity gains with Soviet help.
Yes, initially from about 1952 to 1957, China received significant technical and financial assistance from the Soviet Union, which helped achieve strong growth in industrial production, national income, and agricultural output.
But that relationship soured.
It deteriorated significantly around 1960 due to ideological and geopolitical disputes. The Soviets withdrew their advisors and support, and the two countries became rivals, even enemies, for a period.
And that was followed by the disastrous Great Leap Forward.
Yes, from 1958 to 1962. This was Mao's ambitious attempt to rapidly collectivize agriculture and accelerate industrialization through mass mobilization. However, it was marked by severe economic mismanagement, unrealistic targets, the withdrawal of Soviet aid, and coincided with bad weather.
The results were catastrophic.
Truly catastrophic. It resulted in a massive economic contraction. The overall economy shrank by about 25% and, most tragically, led to a devastating famine that caused the deaths of tens of millions of people. Industrial output also fell sharply. While the exact causes, scale, and death toll are still debated by historians, its catastrophic impact is undeniable. The economy did see some recovery by 1966, however.
Then came another tumultuous period, the Cultural Revolution.
From 1966 officially until Mao's death in 1976, although the most intense phase was 1966-1969. This was initiated by Mao partly to reassert his authority and purge perceived opponents within the CCP whom he felt were taking China down a capitalist road.
What were the effects?
It was a politically turbulent and often violent period. It severely disrupted education, led to the persecution and death or displacement of millions, further damaged the economy, and slowed China's progress. Political struggles continued behind the scenes throughout this time, notably between hardline Maoists like the infamous Gang of Four and more pragmatic reformers, figures like Zhu Enlai and, importantly, Deng Xiaoping, who was purged twice but survived.
That brings us to Phase 2, starting around 1978 after Mao's death, running until maybe 2013. This is the Deng Xiaoping and Deng successors phase.
This is the absolutely pivotal period of reform and opening up Gauge Kaifang. After consolidating power by 1978, Deng Xiaoping fundamentally shifted China's direction. He initiated reform, introducing market mechanisms, allowing private farming and small businesses, decentralizing economic decision-making, all under the strict control of the Communist Party, to improve efficiency and motivate people. And crucially, he pursued opening up, ending China's isolation, and actively engaging with the outside world to learn modern technology, attract foreign investment, and promote trade.
A pragmatic shift.
Extremely pragmatic. Deng essentially introduced state-controlled capitalism. His core strategic insight, according to the study, was that to make China strong and prosperous again, they needed to embrace these capitalist practices and integrate with the global economy. But, and this was key, they needed to do so gradually, learning as they went, and without appearing overly threatening to the existing leading powers, particularly the United States, while China was still relatively weak. Hide your strength, bide your time.
Establishing full diplomatic relations with the U.S. in 1979 was a big part of that strategy, wasn't it?
A major step. At that point, China was still very poor and militarily weak, so it wasn't perceived as a major threat by the U.S. This opened the door to a highly symbiotic economic relationship that lasted for decades.
Explain that symbiotic relationship.
The U.S. benefited immensely from access to inexpensive goods manufactured in China, which helped keep consumer price inflation low in the U.S. and boosted American corporate profits. American companies invested heavily in China to take advantage of low labor costs.
On China's benefit.
China, in turn, earned vast amounts of U.S. dollars from its rapidly growing exports. It used these earnings to build up its industrial base and infrastructure, and importantly, it lent much of this money back to the U.S. by buying huge amounts of U.S. Treasury bonds.
Recycling the dollars.
Exactly. So China accumulated massive dollar assets, U.S. debt, effectively financing American consumption and government deficits. Meanwhile, the U.S. accumulated huge dollar liabilities owed to China. Deng's successors, Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, largely continued this pragmatic direction. China focused on economic development, quietly growing much richer and more powerful, without overtly challenging the U.S.-led global order.
But the study marks 2008, the year of the global financial crisis, as a significant turning point, the beginning of the emergence of U.S.-China conflicts and the waning of globalization. Why then?
The 2008 crisis exposed and significantly exacerbated deep-seated issues, particularly the widening wealth and income gaps within many developed countries, including the U.S. This led to increased social and political resentment among those who felt left behind by globalization, often attributing job losses in manufacturing to competition from countries like China or to immigration. This discontent fueled a rise in populism and nationalism in many Western countries, mirroring some dynamics seen in the 1930s.
And China's perception changed, too.
Concurrently, China's continued rapid economic growth, even through the 2008 crisis, thanks to massive stimulus, meant its relative power reached a point where its challenge to the dominant U.S. position became much more apparent, even if that wasn't necessarily China's explicit intention at first. The sheer scale of its economy and influence could no longer be ignored.
So the era of quiet rise was ending.
Yes, the period of relative peace, prosperity, and smooth integration fostered by globalization began to visibly wane. It started being replaced by rising conflicts, both the internal conflicts between different groups within countries, rich versus poor, different values, populist versus establishment, and the external conflicts between the rising power, China, and the dominant established power, the U.S.
And that brings us to Phase 3, starting around 2012-2013, with Xi Jinping's consolidation of leadership, continuing to the present. How is this phase characterized?
Xi Jinping inherited a China that was vastly richer and more powerful than Deng Xiaoping could have imagined. But it was also a China burdened by significant internal debt accumulated during the previous decades of supercharged growth, facing environmental challenges and perhaps seeing growing internal inequalities.
So a different set of challenges.
Right. Xi's approach, as described, has been multifaceted. He sought to accelerate reforms aimed at making the economy more sustainable and innovative, focusing on containing financial risks like excessive debt. He's aggressively pushed for restructuring the economy to move up the value chain into higher tech industries. He's prioritized achieving indigenous technological leadership in key areas. And he's taken a much more proactive and assertive stance on the global stage.
Internally as well.
Yes, internally, he's also focused on tackling issues like corruption, reducing wealth gaps under the banner of common prosperity, protecting the environment, and, very significantly, consolidating political control under the Communist Party and his own leadership.
And his bold objectives became much more explicit than before. Things like the Belt and Road initiatives.
Exactly. Huge global infrastructure projects under the Belt and Road Initiative, ambitious industrial policies like Made in China 2025, aiming for global leadership in key technologies like AI, robotics, electric vehicles, and goals like China Standards 2035 to influence global technical standards. These made China's ambitions much clearer.
And this is when conflicts with the U.S. really ramped up.
Yes. As China's power, capabilities, and stated ambitions became clearer, especially coupled with the rise of more nationalistic and protectionist sentiment in the U.S., symbolized by Donald Trump's election in 2016, which brought trade wars and tech restrictions to the forefront. Conflicts with the U.S. intensified significantly across multiple domains: trade, technology, geopolitics, ideology. The study draws a direct parallel here to how the rapid rise of industrial powers like Germany and Japan challenged the existing British-led world order in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, eventually leading to major conflict.
How does the material compare the U.S. and China today, using concrete measures of power? Where do they stand relative to each other now?
It uses various metrics, the kinds of indicators we discussed for the cycle archetype, to compare their current positions. For example, China is now the world's largest country in terms of overall trade volume, having surpassed the U.S. share of global trade.
Okay.
It's a rival technology leader, or rapidly closing the gap in many crucial areas like 5G, AI, and fintech. It holds the world's largest foreign exchange reserves by a huge margin, more than double the next country.
Financial muscle.
Yes. It's also become the largest lender and investor in the developing world, giving it significant influence. Militarily, it possesses the second most powerful military, though still significantly smaller than the U.S. military in terms of global reach and overall spending, but increasingly capable in its own region. And it's clearly emerged as the primary geopolitical rival to the U.S.
What about education levels? That was a key factor in the ascent phase.
Right. The picture is mixed, but telling. While the average education level across China's vast population is still lower than in the U.S., the total number of highly educated people is now significantly higher due to China's much larger population.
And in key fields.
Crucially, China graduates about 3 times as many students in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, STEM fields, as the U.S. does each year. This indicates a rapidly growing base of technical expertise essential for future innovation and competitiveness.
But China still lags in some key areas important for global power projection and achieving that ultimate reserve currency status.
Yes, particularly in financial influence, which, as we noted, often lags. China significantly lags the U.S. in reserve currency status. The Chinese renminbi's RMB use in global payments, trade settlement, and as a reserve asset held by other central banks is still relatively small compared to the U.S. dollar's dominance.
And financial centers.
China also lags in having a truly global, open, and trusted international financial center, although Shanghai and Hong Kong are developing rapidly. Chinese financial markets and assets, stocks, bonds, are still significantly underrepresented in global investment portfolios and benchmark indices like MSCI compared to China's large share of global GDP. Foreign ownership of Chinese assets remains relatively low.
And meanwhile, the U.S. financial position.
Meanwhile, the U.S.'s net international investment position in IP, basically, what U.S. entities own abroad versus what foreign entities own in the U.S. has steadily declined. The U.S. is now the world's largest net debtor nation by far, owing the rest of the world significantly more assets than Americans hold abroad. And a large chunk of that debt is held by China.
So the overall picture is incredibly complex and dynamic. A declining but still leading power, the U.S., facing internal strains and large debts, alongside a rapidly rising, nearly comparable power, China, which also has its own internal challenges like debt. They have shifting strengths and weaknesses across different dimensions of power.
Exactly. And according to the cycle archetype, this kind of dynamic, a powerful rising nation challenging the existing dominant nation, is historically when the risk of major conflict becomes highest.
Okay, that's a perfect transition to part 4, where we need to discuss the current wars, the different types of conflict happening now, particularly between the U.S. and China. The study starts by drawing a fundamental distinction between governance within countries and relations between them.
Yes, this is a crucial point in the material. Governance within a country, ideally, is based on established laws, institutions, constitutions, and accepted standards of behavior enforced by a recognized authority.
The rule of law, hopefully.
Right. But governance between countries in the international sphere is described as operating much closer to a jungle environment. International laws, organizations like the UN, and treaties exist, but they have limited enforceability, especially when challenged by powerful nations acting in what they perceive as their vital self-interest.
So ultimately, power matters most.
Ultimately, raw power, economic power, military power, technological power is often the ultimate arbiter in international disputes. This is why military strength remains critically important for nations concerned about their security and influence.
How does the military balance stand right now between the U.S. and China, according to the source material?
The assessment presented is that while the U.S. military is still the most powerful overall in terms of global reach, technology, and budget, it's no longer dominant in every potential theater or in all types of warfare.
Competitors are catching up.
Military capabilities are rising rapidly in rival countries, particularly China and Russia, often specifically designed to counter U.S. strengths in their regions. The study cites experts who assess there's now a significant chance the U.S. could lose, or at least suffer unacceptable costs and damage, in conventional wars fought against China or Russia within their respective geographic areas of strength, like the Taiwan Strait or Eastern Europe.
The most worrying specific scenario discussed is a potential forceful move by China on Taiwan.
Yes, this is consistently highlighted as perhaps the most dangerous potential flashpoint for a major power war. The study recounts the Third Taiwan Strait crisis in 1995-96 as a historical example to illustrate the dynamics.
What happened then?
China conducted missile tests near Taiwan, partly in response to Taiwan's president visiting the U.S., which Beijing perceived as a move towards formal independence. The U.S. responded by sending 2 aircraft carrier battle groups through the Taiwan Strait.
A show of force?
A major show of force. From the American perspective, this was seen as successfully deterring China and upholding stability. However, the study suggests that from the Chinese perspective, it was seen as a humiliation, highlighting their military weakness at the time and America's willingness to interfere in what they consider an internal affair.
And the Chinese reaction to that perceived humiliation.
According to the study, the Chinese leadership drew a very direct lesson from that 1995-96 episode. They concluded they must build military capabilities specifically designed to prevent the U.S. from intervening effectively in their near seas region, particularly around Taiwan.
So they started building counters to U.S. power projection.
Exactly. Since 1996, China has dramatically increased its military spending and focused on developing advanced capabilities like sophisticated anti-ship ballistic and cruise missiles, carrier killers, advanced submarines, cyber warfare tools, anti-satellite weapons, all aimed at raising the cost and risk of U.S. intervention to an unacceptable level.
Which means the risk around Taiwan is seen as significantly higher today.
Yes, precisely because China is militarily far stronger and more capable in its home region than it was 25 or 30 years ago. The balance of power in the immediate vicinity has shifted significantly.
A direct military conflict between the U.S. and China is described in the source as unimaginably horrible.
It is. The potential human and economic costs would be devastating for everyone involved and likely the entire world.
But beyond the potential for hot wars, the source details other types of conflict or wars happening right now, particularly the economic and technological war between the U.S. and China.
Yes, these are already well underway.
Let's start with trade and technology. What's the situation there?
Trade tensions remain very high. While formal negotiations might be paused depending on political cycles, the underlying strategic shift on both sides is towards more domestic production, supply chain resilience, and a degree of decoupling or de-risking.
Both sides are doing this.
Yes. The study quotes President Xi emphasizing that the world is undergoing changes not seen in a century, and stressing China's need to rely more on its large domestic market advantage and achieve technological self-reliance. The U.S. is also pushing policies to onshore or friendshore critical industries.
And China is seen as being potentially able to decouple faster over the next 5-10 years. Why?
That's the assessment presented, primarily because China has spent the last 40 years building a massive, comprehensive industrial base and technological capacity. It's now less reliant on foreign inputs for many things than the U.S. is, in some ways, reliant on Chinese manufacturing. China is also arguably more capable of directing state resources towards achieving self-sufficiency goals.
The tech war is another major front.
A huge front. The U.S. has taken significant actions against major Chinese tech companies. Huawei is the prime example, but also restrictions on sales of advanced semiconductor technology and equipment to China, potential actions against apps like TikTok.
And the stated reason is usually national security.
Yes, national security concerns are often the publicly stated justification. However, the source suggests that a significant, perhaps even larger, unstated motivation behind many of these actions is economic specifically, to try and limit or slow down China's rapidly growing technological competitiveness, which directly challenges U.S. leadership in critical future industries. It suggests policymakers may feel they can't explicitly state, "We want to stop you from competing effectively," so national security becomes the more acceptable rationale.
And is Chinese tech really catching up that fast?
Yes, the material indicates it's becoming very competitive very quickly across a range of important fields, and this has implications for U.S. leverage.
How so?
It means the U.S.'s historical power to control choke points by cutting off access to crucial Western intellectual property or components is becoming less potent than it used to be because China is increasingly developing its own domestic alternatives. And China is also beginning to take similar retaliatory actions, for example, by restricting the export of rare earth minerals crucial for many technologies, or potentially other inputs where China has leverage.
What about the often discussed issue of intellectual property stealing? How does the source frame that?
The study acknowledges this is a significant point of friction and a long-standing complaint from Western companies. However, it also places it in a broader historical context.
Arguing it's not new.
It notes that throughout history, rising powers have often acquired or, let's say, aggressively adopted technology and know-how from existing leading powers as a way to catch up and become more competitive. The British learned from and adopted Dutch innovations in shipbuilding and finance. Americans learned from and adopted British industrial techniques.
So it's part of the catch-up process.
Often, yes. And in the international sphere, where there's no globally effective court or police force to enforce intellectual property law between sovereign nations, unlike within a country, the concept of stealing becomes more complicated, and enforcement relies heavily on national power and negotiation. The point made is that in this type of great power competition, actions are often taken based on perceived national interest and power dynamics, and the publicly stated reasons, like IP theft or national security, may not always fully capture the underlying strategic or economic motivations. This is a conflict where traditional rules don't always apply or are applied selectively.
Okay, moving beyond economic conflict, the next area is the geopolitical and cultural conflict. The source identifies sovereignty as perhaps China's single biggest concern.
According to the study, yes. China's absolute core, likely non-negotiable issues revolve around sovereignty. This includes sovereignty over mainland China itself, but also its claims over Taiwan, its control over Hong Kong, and its territorial claims in the East and South China Seas.
And this sensitivity comes from?
It's deeply rooted in that century of humiliation narrative, the period from the mid-19th to mid-20th century when foreign powers carved up parts of China, imposed unequal treaties, and exploited its weakness. There is a profound national determination across the political spectrum in China to regain complete sovereignty over all territories China considers historically part of it, and to ensure China is never weak enough to be bullied or exploited by foreign powers again.
And this is why they so strongly reject U.S. or Western demands regarding their internal policies.
Exactly. China views external pressure or demands regarding issues like the political system, democracy versus the CCP's leadership, human rights practices, treatment of ethnic minorities like Tibetans and Uyghurs, or the status of Hong Kong and Taiwan as unacceptable interference in its sovereign internal affairs.
Their argument being they don't interfere in U.S. internal affairs.
That's often their counterpoint, yes. They don't try to dictate how the U.S. manages its own social or political issues. Furthermore, the study suggests China perceives a cultural tendency, particularly in the U.S. and some European countries, towards proselytizing. Proselytizing, meaning trying to convert others.
Yes, attempting to impose their own values, moral frameworks, democratic ideals, and political systems on other nations, whether those nations want them or not.
So the combination of perceived threats to their sovereignty and these attempts to impose foreign values is seen as particularly dangerous by the Chinese leadership.
It is described as being seen as a fundamental threat. A threat to the CCP's legitimacy and its ability to govern China according to its own long-standing beliefs, cultural norms, and hierarchical structure. The study states the Chinese leadership likely believes the U.S. would try to destabilize or even topple the CCP if it had the chance.
Which they see as an existential threat.
An intolerable existential threat that they would fight to the death, figuratively or perhaps literally, to defend against. The implication is that issues touching this core nerve of sovereignty and regime survival are non-negotiable and could lead to conflict, whereas other issues might be managed through negotiation.
The study provides some examples of cultural clashes that stem from these deeply different perspectives on governance and values. Yes, it contrasts some key aspects of traditional and modern Chinese culture and governance with prevailing American culture. Chinese culture is often characterized by more top-down decision-making, a strong emphasis on social harmony, civility, and the collective interest taking precedence over individual desires. There's a greater respect for hierarchy and age, and the political system aims, in theory, for rule by the proletariat, meaning benefits should be broadly distributed, even if directed from the top.
Contrasted with American culture.
Contrasted with American culture, which tends to be more bottom-up, places a very high value on individual freedom and expression, often admires revolutionary or disruptive thinking, and tends to respect the quality of an argument or idea more than the hierarchical position of the person making it. Challenge to authority is often seen positively.
And these differences, while obviously generalizations and not applying to every single person, become very relevant during times of conflict or misunderstanding.
Absolutely. The Daryl Moore NBA incident from 2019 is cited as a classic example.
Remind us what happened there.
An American NBA team manager, Daryl Morey, tweeted support for pro-democracy protesters in Hong Kong. In the U.S., this was largely seen through the lens of individual free speech rights. He was expressing his personal opinion, and maybe the NBA shouldn't punish him for it.
But the Chinese reaction was very different.
Extremely different. From the official Chinese perspective, and apparently shared by many Chinese citizens, the tweet was seen as a harmful attack on China's national sovereignty and internal stability. And crucially, they held the group, the NBA, as an organization accountable for the actions of the individual employee. This led to NBA games being pulled from Chinese television, sponsorships being dropped, causing significant financial consequences for the league. It highlights the starkly different cultural frameworks around individual versus collective responsibility and the extreme sensitivity in China around issues perceived to challenge its sovereignty.
Study also mentions the Chinese leadership style as a potential source of misunderstanding.
Yes. It notes that the leadership style, rooted in historical hierarchies, often expects subordinates, whether individuals or even other countries, perceived as less powerful to understand their place, show respect, and obey directives from the top. There can be severe consequences for perceived insubordination or disrespect.
But it's not always adversarial.
No. The study also notes they can be very generous in support of friends or partners to those they trust and who show appropriate respect. An anecdote is shared about Chinese contacts quickly helping the governor of Connecticut obtain critically needed PPE supplies during the chaotic early days of the COVID-19 pandemic when traditional U.S. supply chains were failing. This illustrates a dichotomy expecting loyalty and hierarchy, but also capable of great pragmatism and generosity towards those seen as reliable partners.
So some of these cultural differences might be negotiable or manageable, but others seem more fundamental and harder to bridge.
That seems to be the implication. Differences in business practices might be negotiable, but fundamental values clashes, like the American emphasis on individual liberty versus the Chinese emphasis on collective stability and state control, are very difficult to reconcile, especially when they touch on core political or sovereignty issues.
Given this complex landscape of rising powers, differing values, and potential conflict, how does the material view the kind of strategy needed in international relations today? What works?
It reiterates that fundamental point. In the international arena between sovereign states, raw power is often the most decisive factor in the end. Therefore, it's crucial for any nation to accurately understand and respect the existing balance of power.
Meaning, don't pick fights you can't win.
Essentially, yes. Avoid fighting a war you are likely to lose unless there is a truly strategic, perhaps existential reason to do so, even if it means becoming a martyr. But using power wisely doesn't always mean overt bullying or constant confrontation.
What's the alternative?
Building trust, seeking cooperation, and creating win-win relationships can be far more effective and rewarding in the long run than engaging in lose-lose conflicts. Power is often best wielded subtly, like a hidden knife, as the saying goes, present and ready if needed, but not constantly displayed aggressively, which can provoke counteractions.
And understanding the other side's perspective is paramount.
Absolutely critical. You must strive to understand what matters most and least to the other party. What are their core, non-negotiable interests they will fight for with all their might? And what issues are secondary and thus potentially negotiable?
How do you learn that?
You learn it from studying their history, their culture, trying to genuinely understand their goals and fears from their perspective, not just your own, and also through careful, calibrated, mutual testing, probing limits, signaling intentions.
But that testing carries risks.
It carries significant risks of miscalculation and tit-for-tat escalation. It's like the prisoner's dilemma in game theory. Even though cooperation might be the best collective outcome, the rational choice for each party, fearing the other might defect or attack first, can be to betray or attack preemptively.
So knowing the balance of power is key to finding stability.
Yes, knowing the true balance of power, who realistically stands to gain or lose what in a potential conflict, is what typically creates an equilibrium. It sets the boundaries for what a fair or acceptable resolution might look like, even if that resolution is just an agreement to disagree or to manage competition without escalating to open war.
Okay, let's shift gears one last time to part 5, which deals with the cycles of domestic politics and internal conflicts within countries. The source draws a direct link between wealth and power internally.
It states this as a near-universal dynamic throughout history and across virtually all countries. There's a consistent tendency for those who control wealth, meaning the ownership of the means of production, the key assets that generate income and economic power.
The capitalists, the landowners, the asset owners.
Right. Those groups tend to work together, formally or informally, with those who hold political power, the people who set and enforce the laws, the rules of the game.
The government. The state apparatus.
To maintain their dominant positions and shape the system in ways that benefit them. This dynamic has persisted, although the specific groups involved change over time. Historically, it might have been the monarchy, the landowning nobility, and the military elite working together against the interests of serfs or workers. Today, it might involve financial elites, large corporations, and influential lobbying groups working with political parties and regulatory institutions.
And how does the internal order, the way a country is run, change over time according to this model?
It changes through two main mechanisms, either gradually through reforms and evolution within the existing system,
Peaceful change.
or abruptly, and often violently, through civil wars and revolutions that overthrow the existing order and replace it with a new one.
And when does each tend to happen?
The study notes that peaceful reforms are more likely to happen earlier in a country's cycle, when conditions are generally better, there's more social cohesion, and the system has more flexibility to adapt. Violent, abrupt changes, revolutions, civil wars are more common later in the cycle when tensions between groups are extremely high, wealth and opportunity gaps are vast, the government is seen as ineffective or illegitimate, and the system has become too rigid to reform peacefully. But the underlying processes of struggle for power and wealth, and the tactics used by different factions, remain remarkably similar throughout history.
The material also highlights a tendency, especially by governments and politicians, to favor short-term benefits over long-term health. How does that affect the cycle?
This is identified as a major factor that exaggerates the highs and lows of the cycles, particularly in creating large debt booms followed by painful busts. Politicians are often driven by short-term election cycles or immediate political pressures.
Right, getting reelected.
Exactly. This incentivizes them to prioritize near-term outcomes, make promises they can't keep long-term, avoid difficult but necessary trade-offs like raising taxes or cutting popular spending programs, and generally dislike taking money or benefits away from powerful constituencies. This leads to decisions that might be politically expedient in the short run, but are detrimental to the country's long-term financial health, social stability, and competitiveness. It fuels the debt buildup and delays necessary adjustments.
There's an archetype described in the source with 6 stages for this domestic order disorder cycle. The material focuses on the later stages as being most relevant to the current context in places like the U.S.
Yes, while there are 6 stages outlined in total, the study concentrates on the characteristics of the later stages because they signal mounting internal stress and potential breakdown. Particularly, it focuses on late stage 5.
What defines stage 5?
This stage is marked by conflicts over wealth and power becoming increasingly intense, even described as vicious. This leads to growing disorder within the country, protests, strikes, breakdown of civility, sometimes violence. You also see a significant rise in political extremism, manifesting as populism on both the left and the right of the political spectrum, challenging the established centrist order.
And the study explicitly places the U.S. squarely in this late stage 5 currently.
According to the material presented, yes. It states quite starkly that the level of internal disorder and conflict in the U.S. today is greater than at any time in the author's 71 years of life.
Wow. What evidence is cited?
It points to quantitative evidence presented in charts within the source material. These charts apparently show that current levels of U.S. government debt and money creation are the highest since the 1930s WWII era. Wealth and income gaps are the widest since the 1930s, and measures of political polarization and gaps in values between opposing sides are the greatest since around 1900.
And combined with the external situation.
Right. Combined with the U.S. being a leading but relatively declining power facing a rapidly rising rival power, China, these internal symptoms, extreme debt, huge inequality, deep political division, are seen as strong indicators of being in this late, precarious stage 5 of the internal cycle.
Another characteristic mentioned that becomes prominent from stage 4 onwards, and particularly acute or grotesque by stage 5, is decadence. What does that mean in this context?
Decadence is described here as a society spending increasing amounts of time and especially money on indulgent, unproductive things, often financed by accumulated wealth from the past, or, more dangerously, by debt. Think excessive luxuries, rampant speculation, lavish consumption that doesn't contribute to productive capacity.
And what's the psychological dynamic?
The dynamic described is that the haves, the wealthy elite, often come to feel entitled to their wealth and extravagant consumption, seeing it as a right or reward. Meanwhile, the have-nots, especially during times of economic hardship or perceived unfairness, see this decadence as selfish, unjust, and a sign that the system is fundamentally rigged against them.
Fueling resentment.
Exactly. It contributes significantly to internal friction, class resentment, and a loss of social cohesion. It also has a direct economic impact by reducing overall societal productivity as resources and focus shift from productive investment, building future capacity, towards unproductive consumption, enjoying the present, often on credit.
Bureaucracy is also highlighted as a potential drag in these later stages.
Yes. Established bureaucracies, both public and private, can become entrenched, inefficient, resistant to change, and sometimes corrupt. They can create complex rules and procedures that hinder sensible, productive actions and make it difficult to adapt to new challenges.
Is there an example given?
The U.S. public education system is mentioned as a possible example, specifically how its funding structure, heavily reliant on local property taxes, creates and perpetuates vast inequalities in educational resources and quality between wealthy towns and poor towns. This structure contributes to unequal opportunities, but is deeply ingrained and politically very difficult to change without a revolutionary overhaul of the system.
And there's a particularly concerning point made about a loss of truth and a pervasive fear of the media, especially social media.
This is described as a major dysfunction and obstacle in stage 5. The political and social environment becomes so toxic and polarized that even highly capable, knowledgeable, and well-intentioned people become afraid to speak up honestly about important, sensitive issues or to run for political office.
Why the fear?
The fear stems from the high likelihood of facing vicious personal attacks via traditional media outlets or, more virulently, social media. These attacks often involve spreading lies, distortions, taking things out of context, things that are very difficult to refute effectively and can severely harm not just their own reputation, but also their families and personal lives.
And the consequence?
The consequence is a chilling effect on free speech and open debate. It means that many people whose voices, expertise, and integrity are badly needed in public life choose to remain silent or disengaged to protect themselves and their families. The study relates an anecdote about a highly respected general who said he was willing to die for his country but absolutely unwilling to run for political office because of this fear of media attacks. It starkly illustrates the problem.
So with all these pressures building in stage 5, the conflict, the decadence, the gridlock, the loss of truth, the biggest question becomes how the system transitions from here. The study raises the stark possibility of moving to stage 6, civil war, or revolution.
Yes. The crucial question posed is how much can the existing system bend under these extreme pressures before it breaks?
Does democracy help it bend?
Theoretically, a democratic system allows for a lot of bending because the population can, in principle, change leadership and policy direction peacefully through voting. It offers a safety valve. However, a significant risk in democracies, especially in highly polarized times, is that leaders may be selected based more on popularity, charisma, or their ability to mobilize anger, rather than on the actual competence, wisdom, and willingness to compromise needed to navigate complex challenges effectively.
And consensus and compromise become almost impossible with deep ideological divides, right?
Exactly. Extreme polarization makes finding common ground and forging necessary compromises incredibly difficult. This can lead to political gridlock where nothing significant gets done, preventing necessary reforms and effective decision-making. Which in turn can lead to worsening outcomes, increased public frustration and anger, and potentially a breakdown where people lose faith in the democratic process itself. The risk then becomes a demand for radical change, possibly leading to a revolution led by populist strongmen who promise to cut through the chaos and division, potentially resulting in a shift towards authoritarianism.
But the study notes that revolutions can happen within the existing system during Stage 5, not just as a full-blown civil war, Stage 6.
Yes, that's an important distinction. There can be revolutionary changes in policy and the distribution of power that occur within the broad framework of the existing political order, short of armed conflict.
What are some examples given of these revolutions within the system?
Franklin D. Roosevelt's presidency in the early 1930s during the Great Depression is cited as a prime example. While not a civil war, his policies devaluing the dollar against gold, creating Social Security, massively expanding the role and power of the federal government through the New Deal programs, were truly revolutionary in terms of fundamentally altering the relationship between the state, the economy, and the individual citizen in America. It was a massive shift left.
And a shift right.
Similarly, the rise of Margaret Thatcher in the UK and Ronald Reagan in the US in the late 1970s and early 1980s represented a revolutionary shift, right? Fundamentally changing the trajectory of economic policy away from post-war Keynesianism towards free market principles, deregulation, and privatization.
The study also points to changes in tax rates as a powerful example of this type of revolutionary wealth redistribution within the system.
Yes, looking at the history of top marginal income tax rates in the U.S. is presented as a stark illustration. The top rate went from essentially 0% before 1914 up to over 90% during and after World War II, and then back down significantly following the Reagan reforms. These represent radical shifts in how the system taxed wealth and income achieved through political processes.
Other examples are mentioned from the progressive era in the U.S.
Right, things like the trust-busting movements that broke up powerful industrial monopolies, the establishment of the federal income tax through the 16th Amendment in 1913, and the granting of national women's suffrage via the 19th Amendment in 1920. These were all profound systemic changes, fundamentally altering power dynamics, achieved through political means within the constitutional framework, not through armed conflict.
So the level of polarization today increases the risk of either paralyzing gridlock or potentially a breakdown towards civil conflict.
That's the assessment presented. Deep polarization makes effective compromise extremely difficult. This can result in political gridlock, where necessary changes are blocked, leading to further decay and frustration. Or if tensions become too high and trust breaks down completely, it could lead to some form of civil conflict or breakdown.
What about the current U.S. context?
In the specific U.S. context mentioned, having a relatively moderate president alongside likely split control of the legislature is seen as making gridlock, or very difficult, messy compromises the most probable near-term path. Gridlock, however, carries its own risks, potentially leading to more frustration and increasingly unethical political fighting. Compromise, on the other hand, requires moderates in both parties to effectively stand up to the extremist factions within their own parties, which is politically very difficult.
Is a move to Stage 6 seen as inevitable?
The study is clear. It's impossible and unwise to be confident about predicting a progression to a full Stage 6 civil war. History shows Stage 5 can last a long time, and outcomes are not predetermined. But it stresses the importance of watching the key markers, things like the 18 factors of power tracked in the study, plus other indicators like the degree to which political extremists are gaining power and replacing moderates, the level of political violence, and the acceptance of democratic norms.
The study also makes an interesting point about the types of leaders needed at different stages of this internal cycle.
Yes, it suggests that different historical circumstances require different leadership qualities. In the rebuilding phase, stage 2, after a collapse or revolution, you ideally need leaders akin to civil engineers, practical, capable, detail-oriented individuals who can design and build effective, productive new systems and institutions.
And in times of crisis.
In the revolutionary stage 6, or during the initial consolidation of a new order in stage 1, you often need more inspirational, perhaps ruthless leaders, generals, or charismatic figures who can mobilize people, fight battles, political or literal, and consolidate power.
Examples.
Churchill during WWII and Mao during the Chinese Revolution are given as examples of brilliant inspirational leaders perfectly suited for times of existential conflict, stage 61. But the study suggests they were perhaps less skilled or suited for the patient, detailed, compromise-oriented work of governing during periods of peaceful prosperity and institution building, stage 23. Different times call for different skills.
And just briefly, to round out the cycle, what are the key highlights of the earlier stages, stage 2 and stage 3?
Stage 2 is the period of rebuilding that follows a major conflict or collapse, stage 61. It's often characterized by strong, sometimes authoritarian, central leadership focused on establishing order, security, and designing a productive new system, new laws, institutions, economic structures.
Stage 3.
Stage 3 is the subsequent golden era that often follows successful rebuilding. It's typically a long period of relative peace, stability, and broad-based prosperity. Debt growth in stage 3 is usually productive, financing investments that lead to rising incomes and living standards. Optimism is generally high. There's often relatively equal access to quality education, and opportunities are based more on merit. Entrepreneurs, inventors, and builders are often celebrated as heroes, and there's a sense of high creativity, productivity, and positive collective energy.
The good times. But even in this good stage, the risks that eventually lead to decline begin to develop.
Yes, inevitably, it seems. The seeds of the eventual decline are often sown even during the peak prosperity of stage 3. These include the gradual widening of gaps in opportunity, income, wealth, and eventually values between different segments of society. Poor conditions might start to develop for the majority, even while privileged elites enjoy excessive luxury. Productivity growth might start to slow down, and crucially, unproductive debt often begins to accumulate, perhaps financing speculation or consumption rather than productive investment.
So, staying in stage 3 requires active management.
The study notes that the empires or dynasties throughout history that managed to sustain themselves for exceptionally long periods were those that were particularly adept at remaining in stage 3. They did this by effectively managing these risks, maintaining broad-based productivity, ensuring relatively fair opportunities, controlling corruption and excessive inequality, and avoiding the buildup of excessive, unproductive debt. Failure to address these issues inevitably leads the society into stage 4, which is characterized by excesses, financial bubbles, and increasing social and political friction, setting the stage for the turmoil of stage 5.
This has been an absolutely fascinating, if somewhat sobering, deep dive into some incredibly powerful and seemingly timeless patterns drawn from centuries of history. Let's try to quickly recap the core idea we've explored today.
Sure. We've essentially unpacked the concept, drawn from the source material, that the world order doesn't change randomly or chaotically, but tends to follow large cyclical patterns. These cycles are driven by the complex interplay of interconnected forces. Primarily the fundamental dynamics of money, credit, and debt interacting with economic activity. But these financial cycles are then amplified by and interact with political cycles, both the internal political dynamics within countries, like struggles over wealth, power, and values, and the larger geopolitical cycles governing the relationships between nations, particularly the rise and fall of great powers and the conflicts that often accompany those shifts.
And by studying many historical cases we touched on, the Dutch, British, American, and Chinese examples specifically, we can identify these recurring archetypes and get a better handle on the cause-effect relationships that seem to drive these long waves of change.
Exactly. The real value isn't just understanding the past for its own sake, but potentially using these historical patterns as a kind of template, or maybe a diagnostic tool, to better understand the complexities of the present and gain some perspective on the range of possibilities for what might be coming next.
It provides a framework for thinking about massive, confusing changes.
It does. We've seen how financial cycles, particularly the long-term buildup of debt and the eventual, often painful need for devaluation or restructuring, are frequently central drivers that reinforce the other cycles. And we've looked at how internal political dynamics, the struggles over wealth and power, the dangers of polarization, decadence, and bureaucratic sclerosis interact with these financial shifts, and also with the major geopolitical conflicts that tend to arise between rising and existing powers.
It's a complex picture. Definitely. But seeing it through this cyclical lens is incredibly insightful, I think.
It is. And the apparent consistency of these patterns across vast stretches of time, across very different cultures and technological eras, suggests there might be some deep, almost law-like principles at play in how human societies organize themselves, compete, prosper, and eventually decline or transform.
So here's a final thought to leave you, our listeners, with as you go about your week. Given these powerful, seemingly timeless cycles we've explored today, the predictable arc of empires, the almost inescapable dynamics of debt and devaluation, the way internal and external conflicts tend to escalate when systems become stressed and polarized. What might all this suggest about the path ahead for the world order that we currently live in? And perhaps, thinking more personally, how can understanding these historical patterns, seeing the recurring themes, help you better navigate the big shifts, the uncertainties, maybe even the opportunities that might be coming in your own lifetime? Something to ponder. Keep observing, keep learning, and maybe look for the patterns playing out around you.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.